Let's cross live now to Daniel Rhind. He is a senior lecturer in social psychology at the Brunel University in London. Thanks so much for joining us. Let me just ask you personally how disturbing you find this case, both in the abuse that it alleges as well as the complicity of those higher up who just refused to expose it.
Absolutely, and it's something we've known from our research over a number of years, that abuse is certainly something that's happening in sport, and so it was only a matter of time before those cases come to light and got the publicity that it needs. And it's clearly outrageous if people knew about this abuse at the time and took steps to cover this up, either at the club level or beyond that, more at the national level. So we need a thorough, in-depth investigation to really understand who knew what and what they did and why they took particular action, so we can really understand what happened and put things in place to ensure it doesn't happen again.
And do you fear more of these cases are still being covered up, not just in football clubs?
Sure, I think that the research shows that about 5%, so 1 in 20 boys, research indicates, have experienced some form of sexual abuse in sport. So indeed, we've had 250 calls come forward, but that's still a great gap between that number and what research would help us to anticipate is the number of cases that's really going on. So I think it's the tip of the iceberg, because often there's barriers at every stage of disclosure, right from the child having the ability to tell somebody, then that person believing it and knowing how to manage it and refer it on and not cover it up. So at every stage of that process, barriers can be put in place that means it doesn't reach prosecution or the court. So there may well be a culture which prioritises the reputation of a club over the welfare of a child, and that's clearly not acceptable.
Well, having said that, seeing then where this case stands now, how much does it really mean for the victims that finally they might see justice and maybe even compensation?
Yeah, and we've seen that silence protects the wrong person, and all it took to break that silence is one voice, and that voice was Andy Woodward, who was the first player to come forward on national TV and tell his story. And clearly he's explained how this has been very emotional for him and therapeutic to have been sat there on his own, and then the next week he was sat there with 3 other players, and then more recently many of the voices coming forward to show that he really was not the only person. So hopefully that will be a therapeutic process for him as well as every other player that's come forward. So it's important now that there is that support put in place. We have the hotline that the NSPCC and the FA has established, so it's very right and proper that those people get the counselling to process their experiences and ensure that it no longer impacts their lives for the rest of their lives.
You spoke about the culture of abuse and the process that follows it. I mean, was there something particularly in the nature of these football clubs that kind of made these children easier prey for pedophiles?
Yeah, I think what we know about abuse is that it happens when power meets vulnerability, and football was the perfect storm for that at this time, because the coaches were in such a position of power because of their reputation and their perceived ability and their choices over people's contracts and selection. They were very powerful. And when we look at the child, they've got to invest a great deal. They really want to be the next great player. And so they're extremely vulnerable to be manipulated by people that have paedophilic tendencies. And so it's no wonder that these things happen. And there weren't the safeguards in place then that there were having put in place subsequently, because things were reliant on the culture at the time of reputation, and they're a good coach, so they must inevitably be safe because they're a good coach. And now we realise that that's not an assumption that we need to work with.
Daniel, we're going to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us with that from London.